The year was 71 AD, and the Romans finally were able to get a hold on a rebellion that had been going on much longer than they thought it should. A group of slaves, under the leadership of someone named Spartacus, had enough, and they wanted to rebel against the Roman regime. For the Roman regime was very much a hierarchy, where those at the top benefited from those who were at the bottom. And it was a very harsh hierarchy for those at the bottom, for they didn't have any rights, and they suffered a lot. And this rebellion went on for some time, but finally, the Romans were able to subdue it. Spartacus was killed in the battle, but 6,000 slaves were captured. And this is what the Romans did with them. They decided to make an example of them. So they crucified all of them. And they crucified them and placed them along this road called the Appian Way. Now, the Appian Way, if you were to bring it into modern terms, would be something similar to the 401 that goes from one end of our province all the way to the other, stretching about 800 kilometers. The Appian Way stretched about 600 kilometers. And this was the main road coming in and out of Rome. So everyone had to go through there. And so they crucified these people along that road. But the story gets worse. They not only crucified them, they left their bodies there to rot. Not for days, not for weeks, but for months. Could you imagine that? The only road in and out of the city. How many people went by there? What about you? What do you think it was like if you had to go by there? Rotting bodies on both sides of the roads, left for the elements to destroy. And over time, they started to decay. What was the stench like? What was the gruesomeness of it all? Wild animals would come and eat those bodies at night. And you may have to find yourself walking about trying not to step on flesh that had fallen down. The Romans did this because they wanted to send a message. The Romans had perfected crucifixion. They weren't the inventors of it, but they're the ones who perfected it. And they did it in such a way that they used it as a weapon of intimidation. Leaving those bodies there was telling everybody in society, watch your step. If you, in any way, do something that kind of upturns our system, this is going to happen to you. Watch your step. So we know 6,000 people were crucified at one time. But the Romans used crucifixion for a period of 500 years. So how many people may have been crucified? We don't know. But I would say a lot. Each one of those people had a name. Each one of those people had a story. Each one of those people had some type of circumstances that led them to this terrible fate. But we don't know about them. We don't know anything about them. But we do know one that was crucified, and we know a lot about him, Jesus Christ. We know from the Bible, we know quite a lot of detail. But even outside the Bible, there are historical records that indicate that Jesus of Nazareth was killed by crucifixion. So we asked this question, or I asked this question. What was it about Jesus' crucifixion that stands up above all the others? We don't know anything about the others. We know so much about Jesus. And I want you to think about that question. And I want you to lean over to the person beside you and give them your opinion. And if you're online, you can just type in your chat. I will give you about 30 seconds to do that. Just lean over. Why do you think it was that Jesus' crucifixion stands out among the others? Okay, thank you. So you've had some time to talk about it. You've had some time to think about it. And now I'm going to tell you what I think. The reason why the crucifixion of Jesus stands out among the rest can be detected from the crime that was written over his cross. So when the Romans would crucify someone, they would write their crime and nail it to the cross so everyone walked by would know what they had done. And this is what they wrote on Jesus' cross. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And when we look in the Gospel of John, we see this verse, that once Pilate had actually put this on the cross, the Jewish leader says, oh, no, don't write that. Wrote, he said, I am the Son of God. That's a very, very different message. Because from Pilate's perspective, Pilate was a Roman. And remember we talked about the crucifixion and how brutal it was and how the Romans wanted to keep everyone in check. So anyone who would upset the Roman system and say that they were a king, of course, that's treason, they should die. And that's actually how the religious leaders got Pilate to agree to kill Jesus. Because they said to him, well, Pilate, anyone who calls himself a king is not a friend of Caesar's. Well, Pilate knew exactly what that meant, because Pilate was a governor, but Caesar was above him, and they did not like each other. And if Pilate let this man go free, who he knew was innocent, by the way, and there was no evidence as he was actually going to lead an uprising, but he knew that if these Jewish leaders went to Caesar, well, Pilate's job was on the line. But not only that, his life may have been on the line. He was afraid for himself, so he allowed Jesus to be crucified. But the Jewish leaders said, he said, I am the Son of God. Well, that is different, because that is not saying he's a king of the people, an earthly king, but he's actually more. He's claiming to be God. And in the eyes of Jews, this was blasphemy. This was horrible. How can you, a mere human being, say you are God? For God is so holy, and God is so high and lifted high, and we are down here. How can you say you are holy? How can you say you are God? Sadly, for those Jewish leaders, they missed the whole point. They who should have known better because they had memorized the scriptures, and they were anticipating the Messiah, and they knew he was coming. And when he's standing right there in front of him, they did not recognize him. So I would say that the reason that the cross of Jesus stands out above the rest is because he was not a mere human. He was actually God. He was actually God who sacrificially came down to us to die so that we could live. And that brings us then to our great and big idea. And our big idea is the sacrificial love that was displayed on the cross deserves, no, I would actually say it demands a response from us. That's the least that we could do, is to respond to the cross of Jesus Christ and what he did. God was God. God is still God. But when we talk about deities, do you know that there are so many gods in this world? 18,000 maybe? 333 million are some numbers. It's a hard answer, because if you talk about gods, you talk about gods, and you talk about demigods, and you talk about ancient gods, and you talk about modern gods. You talk about all these things. And people all over the world worship all kinds of deities, all kinds. And when we look at these deities that everybody worships, there's something that they have in common. They have supernatural power. They are considered sacred or worthy of our worship. And they have authority over nature, universe, and the human life. Okay? And if we look at Jesus Christ, we can say, yes, he shares all of these because he is God above all other gods. He demands worship. He deserves our worship. He does have supernatural power, and he does have authority over this universe and over humans. But that's where the similarity ends. Because when you look at other deities and you try to describe them, you can say that they could be impersonal. Definitely not someone with a name and a face. Definitely not someone who you can talk to. They're distant, they're ambiguous, and punitive. But when we talk about Jesus Christ, We know that he is God, but that he is highly personal. He knows every hair on your head. He knows when you stand and when you sit down. If you were sitting in a room with 100 people and everybody in that room had your name, and he calls you by your name, Lily, Sandra, Frank, you would know he was talking to you. Because when Jesus talks to us, we know it deep in our souls. He is so highly personable. He is merciful. He's far from being punitive. So often people think that God is standing up there in heaven with a lightning bolt, ready to find us doing something wrong and ready to strike us. But that's not Jesus Christ. He's merciful, and he's very, very loving. And the cross that he bore was not just something that came about on itself. It was something that was started, and it was in his mind right from the creation of the world. So let's back up and talk about that now. When God created the world, he created it very, very good. It was good. There was nothing that was not good about the creation. But if we look at the creation in the Garden of Eden, it was a hierarchy. Unlike the Roman hierarchy, which was brutal and cruel and mean and structured in a way that the people at the top were benefiting on the backs of those at the bottom. No, this hierarchy was very, very, very different. There was arrows that went up and down, which means that those at the bottom had connection with those at the top at any time. Free flowing. Creation, all of creation was the first thing that God created, and he said it was good. And then he created humans a little higher because he put his own spirit in humans. So humans are very, very special to God. He gave humans the job of taking care of all creation. And that's taking care of, not abusing, unfortunately, as we have so often in so many parts of the world. We have abused our creation. And then God is at the top. This is God's creation. He has every right to be at the top because he created this world. If you created something, do you not have the right to do with it what you want? Do you not have the right to say that I'm in control of this creation, whatever it is? Well, God is at the top. And everything in this world worked perfectly. Everything was in perfect balance, and there was a sense of shalom. Shalom is more than peace. Shalom is a situation where everything and everyone is functioning in a way to their fullest potential. That everyone is working in a way that they are thriving. And everyone is working together in perfect order and in perfect balance. So everything was good until human beings decided that, you know what, it kind of looks good, and we could choose between good and evil. We could be like God. And so they decided that they would ask God to shove over, and then they would move up so that they could be like God. Only problem with that is they can't be like God because we are not God. It's like a 5-year-old in a family announcing to their parents, Mom and Dad, from now on, I'm in charge of all the finances for this family. Yeah, you know that's not going to go very well. Why not? The 5-year-old does not have the capability. Neither do we as humans have the capability of knowing the difference between good and bad, good and evil. It is God who decides that. And once we pushed God out of the way and we said, you know what, we can be like God, death entered this world. Relationships between God and humans were broken. The relationships between human and humans was broken. And the relationship between humans and creation was also broken. Everything was broken, and death entered. Give me a second here. And right from that point, right at the creation, right when all of God's plans and all of his beautiful creation, when everything was working in great shalom and death had entered, right from that spot, we see a foreshadowing of something to come. We see the foreshadowing of the cross. Once Adam and Eve sinned, one of the first things that happened to them is that they felt shame. Before this, they did not know what shame was. but now they knew. And one of the first things they wanted to do was they had this overpowering feeling of wanting to cover themselves. So they got a whole bunch of leaves together and tied them together and made some type of outfit to put on them. But that was not adequate, and God knew that. But here's God's mercy. He now knows that he's been rejected. He now knows that he no longer can come down every night like he used to and just hang out with his creation because he loved them. He now knew that his creation had broken relationship with each other and with all of creation. And he knew that this is not good. But he's merciful, and he also knew that people were feeling so much shame. So what did he do? And the Lord God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. And that's recorded in Genesis. Where did he get the animal skins from? An innocent animal had to die. Death has now entered the world. And God's love is so great for human beings that he's willing to take the goat and use it as a scapegoat to help humanity. Now, this was just the first foreshadowing. And it goes on throughout scriptures. We see constant prophecies that had taken place over thousands of years, given by various people, pointing to this cross. So now we know in God's eyes that what happened in the Garden of Eden was so grievous that the only way to take care of it was through death. And in this case, it was the death of an animal, but this was a temporary fix. For the problem of shame, the problem of death was still there. But those coats of skin were there temporarily to help them cover their shame. As history moves on, we see that the Israelites had now, first of all, we have Adam and Eve, and then time goes on. God calls Abraham, and then the Israelites are formed as a nation. They go off into Egypt as when Joseph takes them all during a famine, and then they start multiplying there. And then after some time, the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt enslaves them. And they're living in a life of slavery for approximately 400 years. And life is very tough for them. And God says, okay, this is enough. It's time for me to act. So he comes down and he calls Moses. Moses, go to Pharaoh, tell him to set my people free. That didn't go over very well. There's no way Pharaoh was going to allow that. Pharaoh absolutely said, no way. But Moses kept saying, you must let my people go. And with each one of those times that Pharaoh came, God put a new curse or a new challenge in front of the in front of the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians had to face this. And interesting, if you study those, you realize that each and every one of those was something that challenged one of the gods of Egypt. For Egypt was a polytheistic society. They worshiped all kinds of God. But God was showing Pharaoh, I'm above all of these, and it's time to set my people free. So when the climax of this story comes about, God says to Moses, tell the people of Israel to get an animal, sacrifice it, put the blood on the doorposts of your house. And this was the first Passover. And as God came down through that Egypt that evening, the Spirit of God, then, everyone was, the firstborn of every household was killed, except for those houses that had the blood. Here we are foreshadowing again. God is saying, I am now rescuing you from physical slavery, but there's a time when it's not going to be the blood of animals, it's going to be my blood that's going to save you from all of your sin. Time moves on, and the Israelites are now in the desert. And this, I'm sure you'll recognize, for we've just finished a series on the tabernacle. This was the altar where the animals were burnt as the Israelites came into the temple. So God asked the Israelites to build this temple because he wanted to dwell among them. He wanted to be with them. But the first thing that when you walked into the temple is you saw this altar. And that's where the sacrifices were held. So before the people could approach the tent or even get closer to it, an animal had to be killed to pay for the sins of the people. And the priests would sacrifice the animals on this altar. And behind the altar, of course, was the tabernacle, with curtains that went from top to bottom and covered the entire area. And when the day that Jesus died, the curtain that separated inside the tabernacle, that separated the part that was holy from the part, the Holy of Holiest, where God's presence was, where the high priest went in once a year to make an offering for sin, that curtain was torn in two. So it was saying, God was saying to us, the veil that's between you and I, the death that came into the world, the separation that came into the world when you decided to reject me, my blood has taken care of it. And then when we move into the New Testament, we read this in Hebrews. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? So we see God right from the beginning. The cross was not something that just happened. The cross was something that was intentional, and it was planned by God. And he had it in his mind right from the very, very beginning. As soon as humanity rejected him, as soon as death came in the world, he had a plan that he was going to deal with it. And throughout all the years leading up to the cross, there was foreshadowings and there was prophecies about the time when Jesus himself would come, and he would spend his blood so that we can be redeemed. So that curse that entered could be taken off our shoulders. So that we can again have that perfect freedom to go to God. At any time, any hour of the night or day, we can go to him. And we can enjoy his presence and his joy. So let's just quickly review what Jesus suffered. He's God. How is God hanging on a cross? We know that this is something that he planned. This is the very purpose for which he came. This is the foundation of the Christian belief. This is it. There's nothing greater than this. This is the paradox of the cross. That Jesus, God, comes and he dies. But it was through that death was conquered. If he had somehow jumped off the cross at the last minute, death wouldn't have been conquered because death would have still been final. But he died so that he could live again and conquer death and show us that death is not the end. He was unjustly condemned. He bore brutal crucifixion of untold pain. He bore the pain of seeing his mother in anguish. He bore the separation of his father. He gave his life. And in dying, he's giving us life. We need to respond to this cross. And on the day of the crucifixion, there were many, many people around. And they also responded to the cross. So I'd like us to look at a few of these and their responses to the cross. There was the crowd. There was Simon of Cyrene. There was the woman, and then there was the Jewish leaders. So let's get into this. The crowd. There was a whole bunch of people there. In those days, crucifixion was a spectacle, so people would come out and watch it. So all kinds of people were there observing what was going on. Now, we know that a crowd is made up of individuals, but the problem is when you get into a crowd, there's a few things that you need to consider. Number one, a crowd can be fickle. 8 days previously, the crowd was saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And now they were saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." The other thing about a crowd is that once you're in a crowd, you can get caught up in the crowd mentality. So even if you're not necessarily thinking about crucify him, all that energy around you might sway your thinking. The other thing about being in a crowd is there's anonymity. You know how sometimes you buy something online and it gets delivered to your door, and then as soon as it gets delivered, pop, there's another email in your inbox that says, "Please rate this." Well, most of the times we ignore those because they're non-committal. It goes out to everyone. We don't feel a personal connection to that, and we don't really, if we're not interested and we're busy, we don't even look at it. But when you're in a crowd, It's out there. It's happening over there. I'm over here. You can fall into the trap of thinking, what's happening there with Jesus really doesn't concern me. I'm in a crowd, and I'm listening to all the noise around me. I'm being distracted by everything that's going around me. People are saying one thing, and other people are saying another. Some are sharing facts, some are sharing rumors, and some are sharing lies. And you're hearing all this, and you're processing it, and you're unsure what to make of it. All of this is affecting your ability to respond to what's happening over there with Jesus Christ. The very fact that that is not just an ordinary human, that's God himself. That's God's plan that he did, and it's for you and it's for me. It's personal. When we're in the crowd, we may not feel that it's very personal. We may feel, oh, that's for them. Not for me. That doesn't apply to me. But it does. Because when God came down to die for us, it was for all humanity. Whether one is a Christian, whether one is a Muslim, whether one is Jewish, whether one is atheist, whatever your creed is, wherever you're from, this is not about your creed. This is about God coming to you, God coming to me, and saying, I've done this for you. How will you respond? Simon of Cyrene is another one. Simon was minding his own business. In fact, he wasn't even there. He was somewhere else, and he was just returning to the city, and he sees this commotion. What's going on? And as he's doing that, the guards grab him and say, here, help this man carry his cross. And so there he was, forced to be very, very close to Jesus. Now we see in our artistic renditions of Jesus carrying his cross, and we see that him carrying his cross where he's kind of dragging it along. But there's evidence that ancient Romans did not crucify people that way. They actually left the vertical pole standing where it should be, and the person who was being crucified just carried the crossbar like this and walked along to the point where he's going to be crucified. So if it was like this, and Simon was asked to carry him, how close was he to Jesus? If he had to stand behind him and carry that crossbar, how close was he? He was close enough that he could hear his belabored breathing. He could hear the moaning and groaning of pain. If Jesus was whispering something, he heard it. No one else, but he heard it. He could smell the metallic smell of the blood. Part of the crucifixion process was that you were beaten, and Jesus was beaten. And the lash what the Romans used, they actually put stones or pieces of bones at the bottom of it, and they tied it together. And they whipped the person, such that at first only the skin was torn, but eventually, depending on how many lashes they gave them, the muscles and tendons would start to separate. So if Simon had a weak stomach, he may have felt like throwing up because he was right there. He could see all of this stuff. There's no way in the world that if he was that close to Jesus, that Jesus' blood did not get on him. It was on his clothes, it was on his hands, it was around. How did that affect Simon? Was it traumatic for him? Did he go home and think about it? Did he wake up at night wondering what it was all about? Did the holiness of God that was in Jesus radiate out so that Simon actually felt it? We don't know, but we can know our response. I would put Simon in a category of people who are not necessarily looking for Jesus, but somehow are brought face to face with him. It could be a person who grows up in a Christian family. You have no choice in the family you're born into. You're born into a Christian family, the person next to you is born into a Muslim family. So because you were born into a Christian family, your parents brought you up in a certain way. And you came to church. And your parents exposed you to Jesus. And you may have learned about Jesus, and you may have experienced something of Jesus. But you need to respond for yourself. You can't allow your parents' faith, you just trail on that. You need to make the decision for yourself. Somebody else in this category is someone who's just maybe not looking for Jesus, but someone drags you along or talks to you about Jesus, you now have to make a decision, because neutrality is not an option. This was Simon's case. And we really don't know what Simon has decided, but you will know what you decide. The women were the faithful ones. They stood by Jesus till the very, very, very end. They were brokenhearted. They were grieving. They were despairing. They were crying. They probably had no words. They had invested the last 3 years of their lives with Jesus as he went about preaching. And they really believed he was the Messiah. They really believed that he was coming to save them. And they gave their hearts to him. And they loved him deeply. And now, here he is. Why doesn't he come down from that cross? Why doesn't he do one of the miracles that he did before? They have no answers. They're lost. They're completely lost. Remember, this is pre-resurrection. They do not yet know that he's going to rise in a few days. But at this moment in time, they are devastated. The world could not be worse for them. But they hang on. They may not say anything because they have no words to say, but they hang on. His disciples had abandoned and went away in fear, but they hung on. They stayed there till the very, very end. And then first thing on Sunday morning, they went to the body to try to embalm the body. And this group of people are for those who love Jesus. And at times, life gets so hard. You don't know where God is. It sounds like your prayers are going to the ceiling and bouncing back to you. And things are dark, and you don't know what the answers are. But hang on. Hang on, because God's track record is that he is faithful, and he will never abandon you. So hang on if this is the category that you're in. The last category of people that I want to talk about today are the religious leaders. And in some ways, this is the most sad group of people, because these people really, really should have known better, but they didn't. They would not accept him as the Messiah. And I think in some ways, because when they interacted with Jesus, Jesus served as a mirror to them. So whenever they were in Jesus' presence, things like their selfishness, their lovelessness was being pointed out to them. You see, these people had so mastered their religion that they've defined their religion in one way, and anything outside that box that they've defined has to be thrown out. So when the very Messiah stands in front of them, he didn't fit their little definition of what religion is. So they cast him aside. Because Jesus supersedes religion. He's not asking you to join a religion. He is asking you to respond to the sacrificial gift he is giving you. The sacrificial gift that he has made for all of us, whoever we are, and whichever category we are in. But these people did not pick up on it because they did not want to die to themselves. You see, the cross is a symbol of death. It was a symbol of death for Jesus. He died on it. But to this day, it remains a symbol of death. And if we want to come to Jesus, we have to recognize that we too have to die. We have to die to our old nature, the nature that it comes from this world, the nature that is selfish and self-centered, the nature that gets angry quickly. We have to become like Jesus. So we die with him and we're raised with him. He died to save us. He lives to give us life. We die to our old self. We live in him. And this is the paradox of the cross, because the cross means death. Jesus died, but it is through that death that he made life for us, available to us. And this is why he came. The purpose that he came is to give each of us a rich and satisfying life. Not to take from us, not to give us hardships, but to give us a satisfying life. We have hope that we will one day be with him again, and everything will be as it was before the fall, and everything will be perfect. But we can start experiencing that right now, right here, today, right now, because the promise is for now. He's already beginning to give it to us. We can already have communion with him because he's broken the way. He's broken the barrier that kept us away from him. And he's giving us life, and he wants to give us the fullness of life. We experience it now. We're experiencing its fullness when we see him. So the question now remains, this cross that God suffered so much on, that he had already planned right from the beginning of the world, that right through the history of the Israelites, right through the entire Old Testament, we see he's pointing to this. And in the right time, he came and he fulfilled it. He fulfilled every last detail of why he came. He conquered death so we can have life. I'd say that's more than deserving. I'd say that's demanding a response. That's the least we can do, is respond. You notice when the two thieves who are being crucified with Jesus, they experienced the same things. They were both being beaten. They were both being crucified. They are both seeing Jesus. But they came to two very, very different conclusions. And I would say that if you are going to choose to reject Jesus, then it should be an intentional decision. Don't just let it slip away. Don't just be living in neutrality, because neutrality is not an option. But also know that if that is your choice, you are giving up on life. But if you choose life, just like the thieves, one rejected Jesus, one accepted Jesus. But if you accept Jesus, also know that the cross also means that we need to die. So which will you respond? Thank you.